This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN.
Welcome to this edition of PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Adrian Garcia, Director of Enforcement for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Today, PHRC speaks through the voice of one of our partners in social justice. Specifically, we're going to be benefiting from his nearly 40 years experience working with regional, national, and international human relations and human rights agencies. And we're going to get his take on issues of disparate treatment and disparate impact that continue to contribute to inequitable access and opportunity to housing. James L. Stowe serves as Director of the Office of Human Rights of Montgomery County, Maryland. And in this role, he has been instrumental in developing new program initiatives and repositioning that agency for success in the 21st century. A program like the Fair Housing Continuing Education Credit Program for realtors, apartment managers, and other housing providers, and new initiatives to combat incidents of hate and violence, among other programs. Jim served as the first executive director of the City of Columbus Community Relations Commission, where he was instrumental in involving city leaders in both the public and private sectors in examining the negative impact of racism on the entire community. In addition, he worked tirelessly with immigrant and refugee communities, assisting in resettlement efforts of these newcomers to the city of Columbus. Director Stowe is an innovator in community outreach, having developed a strategy called the CIT, Community Intervention Teams, which was designed to assist the community with unrest and violence. Jim has served as an immediate past president of the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies, an organization whose membership represents statutorily human and civil rights agencies in the United States, Canada, Mexico, Japan, Ghana, and Europe. He has been a member of the organization since 1987. During his membership, he has held numerous offices and committee assignments within that organization. His professional affiliations and accolades are numerous, too numerous to name today. But I can give you an idea by telling you that he's been president of the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies, president of the National Association of Human Rights Workers, member of the North Carolina chapter of the National Association of Human Rights Workers, member of the National Advisory Committee to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development on fair housing and equal opportunity, just to name a few. And now we welcome Jim Stowe to PHRC Speaks. Welcome, Jim. I'm glad to have you here.
Thank you, Adrian. Pleasure to be here with my colleague.
Man, I tell you, your bio is, well, I mean, you've been in this for a long time. You are what I would consider a social justice warrior. And so the first question that I have for you is, tell me about your social justice journey and how you got into this work.
One of the things I think, Adrian, that really got me to a place of understanding that I have an opportunity to contribute something. Wasn't sure what that something was, or sometimes even I sort of deal with what it is even today, well, as far as that's concerned. But I was always sort of in situations and circumstances where I became the person who was asked to sort of fix it, if you will, to kind of figure it out, to bring people together and to have some way of fashion to be able to sort of solve problems. And so from that sort of origin, I sort of found my way to various tasks and various opportunities to be engaged in that kind of work. One thing led to another, and sooner or later it sort of came to me that I was appointed by the governor of North Carolina to a position within in that time it was called the Community Relations Commission for the state of North Carolina, and served in that capacity for almost 8 years. And in doing so, I learned so much about what now is, and it's become part of my life, is that there were so many people, Adrian, who paved the way for folks like myself and others. And I became really aware of whatever success I would have had came out of, again, the abundance of the efforts of those whose names I'm now beginning to learn about at that time in my career, and had the great fortune of running into some of those folks as well. I remember very clearly being in a situation where I had the occasion to meet the Reverend Dr. C.T. Vivian as an example, and soon learn about him and so much of what he did and what he stood for. And it was so obvious to me, wow, if I could just do a little bit of what he has done, if I can contribute just a little bit of what he has contributed to the movement and to all the things he's been engaged with, from Dr. King, certainly in that work he did, and then after Dr. King, of course, the work he'd been doing for a long, long period of time, and trying to reconcile this issue of racism and how we deal with the issue of racism and privilege and so many other kinds of topics as well in that particular area. And so I became very fascinated in that kind of work. And so I would say to you, Adrian, I kind of got into it by virtue of almost sort of the opportunity, but have been someone who has been engaged in it because of what I've learned and my desire to do something to pay back in a small measure that I would have learned and that I've gained so much from some of my heroes and sheroes, particularly in the civil rights movement. So I'm here to stay and committed to the rest of the way to do all I can to, again, to be a small part of trying to make this world a better place for everybody. I really mean that. I'm passionate about that one issue that we can be in a world where all of us have an opportunity to be successful and to really be in a position where all of our talents and skills can come to play and all our potentiality be realized. I really believe that that's possible.
Excellent. And I'm going to brag on you, even though we didn't talk about this in pre-production, but there's a program that you do out of your agency. It's kind of a civil rights tour, and it's multiple days. And when I hear you say, I want to do something, I've got to imagine that this program, and I'm going to let you talk a little bit about it if you don't mind, but
yes.
I've got to imagine this program has touched many lives and has changed many people's perception and probably has cemented their commitment to this social justice work. Can you talk a little bit about that civil rights tour? And I know I'm not saying I'm butchering the name of the program, but could you talk about it a bit?
Listen, thank you so much for bringing that up, Adrian, because it is something that, again, I got introduced to by a colleague of mine in North Carolina. His name is Bruce Leitner, and he was engaged with the King Center, and I had been also engaged with the King Center in Atlanta, Georgia, the King Center for Nonviolent Social Change in Atlanta, Georgia. And I've been working with them on some issues as well. And Bruce Leitner had put together a tour from Raleigh, North Carolina. They went down and had some experiences throughout the South. And so when I had a chance to go on the tour, I thought to myself, what a wonderful opportunity, what a wonderful vehicle to teach. Because if you're not teaching and not having an opportunity for people to learn and experience by lessons learned, by being able to ask the questions and meet the folks who were involved. And at that time, there were so many of the civil rights icons that were living at the time we started this tour, that it really was a wonderful opportunity for people to, in our profession, to not only see the things and touch the places and visit those places, right, but also to touch the people and have an opportunity then to have those kind of conversations. So we begun the tour. We call it right now the Maryland Civil Rights Educational Freedom Experience. That's open to any and everybody that wants to go along with us. But what we try to do is totally immerse ourselves into this thing called the civil rights movement. And so we start off in Greensboro, North Carolina, with the famous sit-ins that took place February 1 of 1960. And then we find ourselves moving down south into, of course, Alabama. I should say first into Atlanta, Georgia, where, of course, Dr. King is buried along with his wife, Coretta Scott King, and the Center for Nonviolent Social Change. And also begin to see the real origin of this movement through the SCLC. Its headquarters was there also in Atlanta on a sweet Auburn Street there in Atlanta. But at any rate, we moved from there then on down into Alabama, as I was mentioning, and we talk about what happened in Montgomery, and then we talk about what happened then in Selma, and then on in Birmingham, and then what happened, of course, down in Memphis, Tennessee. Little Rock, Arkansas is also on our agenda, as well as Jackson, Mississippi. And so you get a chance to really to see all these things that happen that we read about and that we've studied and we try, in fact, to find its way into our work. But when you actually see it, Adrian, when you touch it, when you talk to people, it's a very different kind of experience. And I should tell you, too, this is our 11th year of doing this tour. And I've learned something every single time because, again, in our work, you never get to a point where you know it all because you always find there's one more little wrinkle, there's one more little story that maybe you don't know, one more anecdote that someone can kind of share with you about what would have taken place. And it's a personal account in many instances, which makes it so great because you're also learning to look at what you've learned vis-a-vis through either books or articles or other research you've done, compare it with a person who was actually there. So in the instance of Selma, I'm talking to someone who was on the bridge on Bloody Sunday, not someone who read about it, not somebody who teaches it right, but they were actually there. And so we have that conversation, that story being told. Her name is Joanne Bland. And she talks about that as a 12-year-old being on that bridge on that day. It's a whole different kind of experience. And so we hope to do this for folks who want to go and have the experience. And I will tell you, to your point and your observation that you made, that those who have gone have said that it was a life-changing experience for them. Because before we go, we want to be assured that persons going on the tour, having the experience, understand that this is not a sightseeing opportunity. It is not a chance for which one can sort of just pick and choose as you go. We're asking those who really, really want to be on the experience to totally immerse themselves into that experience. And before going, learn about what you're about to see. So we have, in fact, involved our Montgomery County public libraries in our tour. And we have a pre-tour meeting and session for which we learn about all the various resources that might help persons better understand the experience that they're about to, in fact, be involved themselves in. And so I just share with you that it has been the kind of opportunity then to not only learn, but also experience. That's why it's called, instead of tour, it's called the experience, because we do that. And the people that we meet, and I should also say the food that we eat, Adrian. Let me put that out there as well, because again, those of us who may have some Southern roots or have some sort of way of finding ourselves, it is absolutely over the top. And the way that people serve themselves and serve you, you see the love and hospitality coming through. That is true. That Southern hospitality thing you hear about is for real even today.
All right.
So thank you for allowing me to say something about that.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I know that I've heard from some of my colleagues that have participated how inspiring it is and how intense it is when you really get into the experience and you're speaking to some of those folks. I'm going to switch gears and briefly talk about the organization that you were past president of. Obviously, you're not current president, but I wanted to get a sense. I want people to understand the importance of human relations, human rights on a global scale. And so could you tell us what IORA is? What is IORA? I mean, from your perspective as a past president.
I will say first and foremost that our current president, Elisa Warren, who is the director for the Missouri Human Rights Commission, and she has sort of moved us to a course to really look further and more directly at the international perspective of our work. And so we're very excited about what she's doing as our president, and has recently got back from Geneva, Switzerland, where she represented IORA in that particular arena, looking at the human rights issues around the world. And so we're so very pleased that the work she's doing and bringing back to us. But my perspective on this is that, first of all, it's the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies, begun back in 1949.
Wow.
And it came out of an experience for many of those folks who were away at war and found themselves in situations in the European theater that they were able to access both opportunities, resources, privileges, and rights that they, in fact, were never used to and accustomed to back in the United States of America. And when they came back from the war, and then found themselves in many of the cities all across America, wondering why are we not able to experience the same level of freedom and movement and access to resources as we were then. And so I'm so pleased that those folks who were part of the process came together, initially through the National Association of Human Rights Workers, which began in 1947. But they were able then to say themselves, as agencies began to sort of take root in various cities across America, there ought to be a way then that we ought to be able to coalesce around some of the issues and concerns that face all of us And so it was out of that particular kind of orientation that people came together and formed then again the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies. And out of that then came a real opportunity for there to be this gathering of information, to be this sort of place that could be the epicenter, if you will, of ideas and resources, research, training was obviously a big part of this as well, for organizations that were forming, as I mentioned, all across the country. And so it was to be this network of organizations to come together and to be ones that were put in place by their governing bodies that actually had statutory responsibility for enforcing the laws of their particular communities. So that was one of the other kind of criteria for being a part of the organization. You had to have some authority to, in fact, to enforce the laws that were, in fact, before you in your particular communities. And so it was around that particular kind of sameness that this organization got going. And so today, we are engaged in training. We are engaged in opportunities then to bring us together in our various conferences. And of course, with the advent of COVID, we went into a very different mode of doing a lot of things remotely and through webinars and other kind of training opportunities that will continue as our president directs us. And so I think one of the things that we're really looking for now is where we can have impact in the work that each of your agencies do. In the state of Pennsylvania, for example, you've got a lot of local agencies beside the state. Can help them do the work that they do locally and have some impact in ways that are meaningful for them. And so we're constantly trying to find opportunities to do just that, to have their work available and accessible to persons that are out there that are our members. And of course, we're always looking for new members as well as they come into to place. So today, some of the biggest issues that confront us is obviously employment discrimination. We still work very hard with the U.S. Equal Opportunity Commission in that work. Of course, with HUD on the work involving fair housing, a big part of our work as well. And then a lot of us do work around community relations. And that's the work that involves engaging communities and trying to find ways and have impact where laws may not necessarily exist, but the need to have someone who has the ability to go into groups, create the kind of group dynamics that allow communities to flourish and work together as our communities become more and more diverse. That they have ways to kind of work through those various cultural differences. And so that work also is a part of what we do and try to lift up and try to also reach out to folks to add best practices as part of our agenda as well. And so folks have ability to learn, what you're doing there in Pennsylvania, for instance. Does it have an application for what we do here in Montgomery County, Maryland? Right. Those kind of exchanges happen all the time. So that is IORA, at least from my perspective. As a past president, as I said before, we are moving with, I think, legitimate and intentional speed, as it were, toward making sure that the international part of our name really has some real relevance too. And our president, Elisa Warren, is working on that, post haste, because I think it's important for us understanding that we live in such a small world anymore, Adrian.
Yes, we do.
That impact us again across the waters. Have a way of finding themselves back home for us in Main Street, USA. And so it's important that we are engaged in that kind of way.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to switch gears and talk about fair housing. And we've talked about this in the past. We know that the Fair Housing Act has two goals. And the first one is to prohibit discrimination and educate folks and so on. But I want to focus in on the second goal, that of affirmatively furthering fair housing. And our viewers, many of them may not know what that is. Could you break it down for me from your perspective, that affirmatively furthering fair housing? Because, it's important. Well, I'm just going to let you go ahead and get into it so I don't take up too much of the time.
Thank you for that question. And it's one that's been on our minds, of those of us who've been in the fair housing arena, and there are those who are part of that arena. They've been around a lot longer than I, who have a lot more wisdom about these kinds of things. But affirmative furthering fair housing was one of the concepts that we really talked about years ago in terms of trying to get a real focused effort from cities and states across this country to really commit themselves to fair housing. It's one thing to say you are, it's another thing to see some actual practical applications of where people have demonstrated that they, in fact, are committed to fair housing. And so the affirmative furthering fair housing was a real effort that now becomes part of the law, by the way, that there is a requirement that, in fact, states and cities and other municipalities are engaged in the kinds of practices that shows their commitment toward providing access, fair access, not only to affordable housing, but also to housing in general in their communities. And to be able then to show proofs positive that they, in fact, have done the kinds of things that, in fact, lead to that outcome. And so, and in this particular instance, we're talking about, as an example, if a city makes a commitment, and here was the other piece that was so helpful to really put some teeth into this. If they're getting any HUD dollars, any federal dollars coming to their communities, this was the binding piece, if you will, that really made the incentive to be in compliance for cities and communities across this country, because in fact, those monies were being threatened. In other words, if they were not coming to your cities because of your lack of compliance, then we felt then people would listen and be attentive to what we're talking about. So now, so these, again, these cities and communities across America then are required not only to say that we're committed, but also what's your plan? How are you going to, in fact, invest in your community? It may be in economic development, for instance. It may also be in some other area of aspect of your community. But how are you engaging the communities for where there is a need, as it were, for these kinds of enhancements in your community? In these instances, we had cities and some folks were simply putting something down on a piece of paper, as an example. And when the issue of the money came in, Adrian, when no longer would the funding be free flowing to your community because you had not done the things that you said you had done, then I think the attention was gotten from all across America that this is important. So we're so pleased that there's been further emphasis on affirmatively furthering fair housing. HUD is serious, and we're so very, very glad that they are, because it was a struggle for many, many years that it wasn't quite there enough. And because of the reason of being able to also look into these kinds of matters in terms of monitoring the progress, in fact, going further than just receiving those reports at HUD, and actually going back and looking to see if these particular activities were accomplished and what were the outcomes that they were promised. And so now those things are on the board. I'm so pleased to note to our audience today that there's been a new emphasis been by Secretary Fudge then to make reassure then that these things are being done and taken seriously. And so to affirmatively further housing means that you are doing something to, in fact, move forward in your community the idea of fair access to housing opportunities for all persons in your community.
And I mentioned as we started our program, your nearly 40 years of experience in social justice. And I want to ask you, where are we, in your opinion, as a country in advancing fair housing access and opportunity? I make the argument that, we're celebrating 56 years of the Fair Housing Act this April. And we've pretty much done this the same way for the last 56 years. And COVID, I think, has taught us that, or at least the COVID pandemic taught us, that a lot of those disparities still exist today. So I ask you, where do you think we are as a country on living up to the promise of fair housing?
I think we have told ourselves that we are a community. We are, and I mean a community in a very large sense, broad sense, the word community, that embraces fair housing. As a matter of fact, we say, again, I'm saying this by way of illustration, that you can live anywhere in America that you can afford to live. There are no restrictions about where you live. You can live where you want to live. But when we do things that would suggest then that becomes a impractical kind of opportunity for many, many folks, then maybe we're not so far along as we think we are. We made progress, absolutely, no question about that. But what we're starting to see, slowly but surely, in my opinion, are persons who are finding ways to remove themselves from certain kind of communities, and whether it be gated communities as an example, whether it be communities for which there are maybe incentives to have additional persons in those communities that are somehow or another flawed by having significant kinds of incentives to keep people out, condo fees as an example, homeowner fees as an example, other kinds of amenities that are part of the process but cost an enormous amount of money for some folks. And so while it's open to persons who, quote, can afford it, right, it kind of balances itself back to a situation where it's certain kinds of persons who can afford it that end up living in these communities.
Correct.
And so I think then that the intent is still out there, and I think the purpose for which you all work for is there. But it really comes down to, persons believe they ought to be able to live where they want to live. And if it's not besides you, Adrian, for instance, well, then, nothing should be wrong with that. The bigger question is, do we want a diverse community in the first place? Do we want to have neighbors that may speak a different language, that may, in fact, have a different culture, as an example? May, again, be in an environment that is so different from yours that sometimes it is uncomfortably unfamiliar to you. Do we want that? So the question becomes, beyond just being, again, your ability from a legal standpoint to live where you want to live, who wants to live in a house and not a community? Who wants to live in a house and not a home? And so the question becomes, then, how do we get to a point where we look at the bigger outcome that really is intended for us when we talk about then free housing? Housing that would be open, equal to every person. It is to be in a part of a community. And that's the thing I'm not so sure, Adrian, that everybody wants. I think there are some persons who see themselves as having sameness or homogeneous kind of environment, comfortable. Listen, I've earned it. This is what I desire. This is where I want to be. What's wrong with that? What's the problem with that? And so I think persons got to figure out kind of where we are as a society, and to know that may not necessarily be a fair housing question. I think it's a bigger question than that, is that do we even think about this whole idea that Dr. King proposed many years ago? Does the beloved community have any chance of existing in the United States of America? I will tell you this, where communities have come in together and worked together and have had persons from around the world live around them, they've found their lives being more enriched by that experience, not somehow or another taken from. They've seen themselves be elevated to a whole different place of familiarity, of being able to understand the world around them, education and culture, and all kinds of things that they would not have experienced, but for being in a community where there is this great diversity. But that may not be, Adrian, a desire that everyone has.
Oh, Jim, wow. What a great way to end this segment. I want to thank you for joining me today. I know how busy you are, so this has been an honor, and I like working with you, and I like being able to pick your brain. So thank you so much for being with us on PHRC Speaks.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I also want to thank you, the viewer, for joining us today. You could have been anywhere else, and yet you decided to join us. For more information on this topic, or if you believe that you've been a victim of discrimination in a housing transaction, you can visit us online at www.phrc.pa.gov or give us a call at 717-787-9780. We're also pretty easy to find online on Facebook, X, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, so check us out. That's going to do it for this edition of PHRC Speaks. Until next time, take care, be good, and be fair to each other.
This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN.